Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister had a clever slogan during the election: spend less, invest more. Now, I know they are fond of slogans, and it was a good one, even in my opinion. Spending less sounds good. Investing more sounds good. And I want to believe the Prime Minister when he says that. And I think, Mr. Speaker, a lot of Canadians wanted to believe the Prime Minister when he said that. In fact, I think a lot of Canadians took that promise, including with his promise to negotiate a win with the U.S., and we're still waiting for that. And I think that is probably why many Canadians voted for this Prime Minister. So let's give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt for a minute and believe him and assess his promise to spend less and invest more. Is the Prime Minister spending less on operating expenses? No. The Parliamentary Budget Officer says, in fact, that the average deficit over the next 5 years will be double what was projected last year in the fall economic statement. The Budget Officer says, and I quote, "The deterioration primarily reflects new day-to-day operating measures and increased provision for liabilities." That doesn't sound like spending less, Mr. Speaker. The PBO goes on to say, quote, "Absent measures since the fall economic statements and measures announced in Budget 2025, the day-to-day operating balance would have been in surplus position over 2026 to 2030. But new operating measures since 2024 and in Budget 2025 shift the day-to-day operating balance from a surplus to a deficit position." From a surplus to a deficit. That doesn't sound like spending less either, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The PBO says we are spending more. And perhaps that's why this government is so mad at the PBO and is looking to fire him for telling the truth to Canadians. Well, thank God that the PBO is here to tell the truth to the Canadian people, because we sure aren't getting it from the government. Let me ask the same question about the second promise, Mr. Speaker, the promise to invest more. Is the Prime Minister investing more? No, because the Prime Minister has instead dressed up normal operating spending and now calls it investment. Again, we have the PBO to thank for shining light on the Prime Minister's attempt to cook the books. The PBO says, quote, "The government's definition of capital investments is overly expansive." And the PBO goes on to say that 30% of what the Prime Minister says is investment is actually just day-to-day spending. That doesn't sound like investing more. In fact, it sounds again like spending more, Mr. Speaker. And again, I wonder if that's why this government is so intent on driving the PBO out of office. They don't like the rules. They don't want to play by them, and so instead they'll get rid of the referee, Mr. Speaker. We've heard these similar promises before. For 10 years, we've had Liberals in power promising us that deficit spending would make us richer. If I had a nickel for every time I heard the word investment, Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't be a politician. And we were told that even though the government was going to spend more, it at the same time was going to exercise financial restraint. In fact, in the last federal budget, some 18 months ago, because they needed extra time, but we still got this budget, the Liberals set out 3 key fiscal anchors. One was to cap federal deficits at about $40 billion. The second was to maintain a declining debt-to-GDP ratio. And third was shrinking deficits to below 1% each year. But unfortunately, Budget 2025 breaks every single one of these goalposts. But these goalposts weren't selected out of thin air, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it was the Liberal government that put these in place. In the 2024 budget, the Liberals said that, for example, reducing the debt-to-GDP ratio was, quote, "key not only for fiscal sustainability, but also to preserve Canada's AAA credit rating, which helps maintain investors' confidence and keeps Canada's borrowing costs as low as possible." So this same government last year said that these goals were so important to our AAA rating, but now want us to believe that they are not important, and therefore we should adopt some new fiscal anchors. I think Canadians can be forgiven for questioning why that is. The deficit, Mr. Speaker, has ballooned to over $78 billion. Rather than lowering the debt to GDP ratio, Budget 2025 will actually see it rise in this fiscal year and the next several fiscal years. Lastly, deficits will not stay below 1% of GDP, but will rise to 2.5% of GDP in this fiscal year. In fact, Budget 2025 shows that deficits will be above 1% of GDP well past 2030. Now, I know the Liberals love to talk about our AAA credit rating, but they don't like to talk about is what the credit rating agencies are saying today. And in fact, just after the introduction of this budget, Fitch, one of the international credit rating agencies, took note of the budget, unfortunately not in a good way, Mr. Speaker, and said the following of Canada, quote, "Persistent fiscal expansion and a rising debt burden have weakened its credit profile and could increase rating pressure over the medium term." Now, Fitch went on to warn the government, and I hope they're listening to this warning, that, quote, "The Canadian government has a track record of upward deficit revisions with subsequent budget updates consistently worse than prior projections. Federal finances run a high risk of further deterioration." These aren't my words, Mr. Speaker. They're not the words of the opposition. They're the words of our credit rating agency, upon which our AAA credit rating depends. And that's a troubling analysis by this credit agency, Mr. Speaker, because any change to that credit rating would be catastrophic and would lead to much higher debt interest charges for Canadians. But behind every number, Mr. Speaker, is a human story. It's a story of a family struggling to get by, to make ends meet. And I want to share just one of those stories from one of my residents who wrote to me just after the introduction of the budget. His name's Ryan, and he said, "I'm writing to express my deep concern about the rising cost of living in our community. I've lived in the same neighborhood for more than a decade, and almost every essential cost of living has increased dramatically." And he goes on to tell me, to illustrate this, I've reviewed my own expenses from 2013 to 2025, and here are the actual numbers for my household. Now, maybe the Liberals should take note of this. This is how you budget. You keep track and you assess. So I hope they're taking notes. Ryan says groceries are up 200%, electricity 133%, cable and internet up 150%, vehicle insurance up 300%, fuel up 100%, water and sewer up 168%, accounting fees up 150%, and property taxes up 112%. And he calculates that his personal cost of living has increased by 154% over the last 10 years. He says, "From my perspective and the perspective of many residents struggling with similar increases, this situation feels fundamentally unfair." I agree, Mr. Speaker. This is unfair to Canadians. As of 8:45 this morning a.m., Mr. Speaker, every Canadian's share of the national debt was over $30,000. In fact, it's $30,568. And then to that, add your provincial share, and I'm in Ontario, and that's another $29,282 for a total of just shy of $60,000. Mr. Speaker, 7 weeks ago this morning, I had my first baby girl. Thank you. And that has changed my life dramatically, increasingly with less sleep. But it also keeps me up that the federal government, by its actions, have handed her a credit card bill of $30,000. So before she's even taken her first steps in life, she has a federal debt. But I do believe there's hope for an affordable Canada. First, the government must return to its senses and drop the accounting gimmicks. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, treat every tax dollar with the humility and the sanctity of trust that it demands. Canadians work hard for every dollar they earn, And I want a future for my daughter and for all Canadians that's full of opportunity, not debt. And that's a Canada that I will fight for.
Questions and comments. Question and commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's interesting when I listened to Premier Doug Ford, a Conservative, and he, in essence, said that we should all be passing the budget. And he was pleased that the budget actually passed. And the reason for it is because he believed that we needed to have a Team Canada approach. As we have a Prime Minister that's out and about securing more markets for Canadians. Exports are very important. We are a trading nation. We make up less 0.5% of the population, yet we contribute 2.5% of world trade. We are a trading nation. So when you have even individuals like Premier Doug Ford saying that this is a good budget that should pass and we should have a Team Canada approach, what would he have to say to Doug Ford?
You know, I'm a member for York Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The other side loves to talk about Team Canada approach. And while we all want Canada to succeed in its trade negotiations, especially with the United States, I have seen nothing about a Team Canada approach from this government. They provide no information to Canadians about what the state of our negotiations are. In fact, we had the chief negotiator for the Government of Canada at the Committee on International Trade on Monday, and he said there are no negotiations ongoing with the United States right now. So could he tell me what's the state of our negotiation? What is the state of the most important relationship we have in the world?
Question and commentaire.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes, Verchères. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate my colleague on the birth of his child. I know what that's like. It can be hard, but it's also so wonderful. Here's my question for him. The colleague across the way reproached the Conservatives for not having voted for the budget, and I could make the same comment, but for different reasons. We are very upset about the budget. All of the Bloc Québécois budget asks were ignored. We're not in the budget, so we cannot support it. Budget 2025 denies the importance of fighting climate change. So how are the Conservatives voting against this budget, even though the budget is quite conservative?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my Bloc colleague for the question. I may not agree with all of his points on the budget, but one thing I do agree with him on is that this government didn't negotiate with them. They didn't speak to them. They didn't take their demands seriously. And Canadians gave the government a minority mandate. And I have heard, and I'm sure the members opposite have heard, a desire for Canadians, for Parliament to work together. But that was not on display with this government's budget. They didn't take any of the opposition criticism seriously. In fact, they rammed it through. And so I sympathize with my Bloc members who didn't get a fair negotiation with this government.
You know, member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank our honourable colleague from York Durham, already making an impact here in Parliament. He spoke of the generational nature of this budget in terms of the generational debt that it's levying against our future and our kids' future. One of the things I want to mention is that we are now spending more servicing our debt than we are in healthcare transfers to our provinces. We're gripped in the middle of a mental health crisis, an opioid crisis that has seen more Canadians die since 2016 than in World War II. So through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask our honourable colleague, is it just woeful negligence or ignorance on the sides of the Liberal?
The honourable member for York Durham.
Mr. Speaker, I would hazard to say it's both. These Liberals don't seem to know how to budget, and they don't seem to know how to keep promises. They told us that fiscal restraint was important in 2024, but in 2025 they double the deficit. And that's debt that everyone's children will have to pay and everyone's grandchildren will have to pay. And in fact, we spend more on interest payments now than we do on healthcare transfers, than we do on all the money the government collects in GST. So I hope the members will take that to heart and get our budget under control.
The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni, a brief question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I want to congratulate my colleague on his newly born baby. That's such a blessing. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the Conservatives they temporarily scrapped the 25% ferry import tariff, sending Canadian shipbuilding jobs to heavily subsidized foreign yards. The finance minister at the time said these tariffs that don't serve any purpose because the ships to where they apply are not capable of being built in Canada. This tariff generated $118 million over 6 years, and the Liberals permanently scrapped the tariff. Mr. Speaker, that money could have been building capacity in Canadian shipyards. Does my colleague agree that we need to bring back that tariff and create a deterrent and reinvest in Canadian shipbuilding capacity here in this country and keep jobs in this country and build ferries here?
The honourable member for York Durham, a brief response.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I do agree with is that we need to figure out what this government has done with the tariff revenue, because Canadians don't know. They've collected, so they say, billions of dollars in tariff revenue over counter tariffs, tariffs against Chinese products, tariffs against American products, and that's tariffs that are taken out of Canadian businesses. So I'd like to know where that money is going. Maybe it should go to help our industries who are suffering, but they haven't told us and they won't tell us.